This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, JZ Microphones, Spectra 1964, Atom Audio, and Isotope. You're hearing my voice right now on a JZ pop filter and BB29 microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX100D mic pre and Isotope RX and Ozone, all recorded safely onto an OWC SSD. So get ready to rock.
Every room, just the dimensions of it will kind of dictate which frequency that the room's going to resonate at. Kind of going back to like the 8-foot ceiling in my studio, that coincides with like 140 hertz or right around there. And that means at that frequency, the room's amplifying that sound. And then at other frequencies, depending on where it falls on the wavelength, it's going to cancel out and then, amplify again other frequencies. It's all math-based.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. No matter where you like to rock in the galaxy, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron lets you record with confidence over USB-C with up to more than a gigabyte per second real-world performance. Transfer tracks in seconds and take your sessions with you wherever you go. Built for reliability, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron is waterproof, dustproof, and crush-proof. Find the new OWC Envoy Pro Electron and all your storage needs at maxsales.com/rockstars. If you're ready to discover the secrets to making your mixes sound great no matter what your studio situation, then check out my free mixing course, mixmasterbundle.com, where I show you how to get great sounding mixes in your studio using simple techniques and free plugins. And when you're ready for more advanced studio skills, then check out recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy, where you can learn from Grammy-winning teachers to help you record, edit, mix, and master your best record ever. Use the code Rockstar right now at checkout for 10% off any course for a limited time. Howdy Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Graham Wax, who moved from Southern California to Nashville in 2011 and started his music career by engineering records for local artists. While transforming his home into a recording studio in 2013, he discovered the need for affordable acoustic treatments and information on home studio acoustics. Graham started building panels and diffusers in his backyard, and by 2018, this hobby grew into a business, City Acoustics, which is now located in a shop in East Nashville. Graham and his team before have worked with hundreds of clients on their studios, offices, restaurants, home theaters, gyms, and more, and despite its small size, MCA is shipping panels across the U.S. and consulting on studios internationally. Clients have included Grammy winners John Blass, Hayley Williams of Paramore, Clark Schleicher, Dave Audet, Scott Underwood of Train, and Esben Adony Ramirez. Graham's passion is education and empowering people to learn something new as well. So today we're going to dig into the topic of choosing the best acoustic treatment for your home studio so that both your recordings and your mixes sound awesome and you can make your best record ever. Thanks so much to Anders at Atom Audio for making our introduction. Please welcome Graham Wax to Recording Studio Rockstars. Graham, are you ready to rock, my friend?
Yeah, let's do it.
Better than that, man. Let's make sure we sound great while we're rocking.
Yeah.
Great to have you on the show, man. Nice to meet you. You're doing some really cool stuff, and it was cool to hear some of your music and go check out City Acoustics. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you got into all this stuff, and give us the brief arc of starting out in music and recording and ultimately designing acoustic treatment stuff.
Yeah, I think like most people, or a lot of people probably listening to this, I started out in bands in high school and was playing the drums when I was 11. And then through that, spent a lot of time in studios in high school, and then went to school for music performance and production. And then through that, just spent more and more time in studios and loved that side of things. So I started engineering came to Nashville for an internship at Ben's studio at the time, which is RCA Studio A, now Dave Cobb's room. And through that, loved it. Stayed here in Nashville after that. Toured for a little bit, and then was mostly engineering and making records. I had a couple different studios in town, and both of those were home studios. One was just like a basement room, and then the second one was a house that I turned the whole thing into a studio. And so through both of those, spent a lot of time figuring out, what to do acoustic treatment wise. The first one was like, hey, where can I go buy this stuff? And then everything was super expensive and hard to get and didn't look all that complicated. So I built it. Yeah. And then the second one, I was like, okay, well, I know how to build it. Let's do, just do it a little bit better. And then started making it for like some friends and other engineers and musicians in town. And then through, years of just kind of updating things and trying out new things, started to get really into the actual like acoustic side of it and figuring out what was working and what wasn't working, and kind of struggling through that process. And all that sort of led to starting City Acoustics and designing acoustic treatment products and for other spaces, and doing acoustic design for studios and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So Rockstars, we've got a playlist of both music that Graham has worked on in the show notes, as well as a YouTube list of some of the videos that you've done over there where you show off your facility and everything. And it's pretty cool. It actually, I kind of love seeing that stuff, because there's still a part of me that would like to be in the wood shop every day, building something.
Yeah. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. You've really created a cool space, and you do cool things like, create templates and really show people how you do this whole process of building stuff, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I had zero background in really making anything. So like really? no woodworking background and certainly no manufacturing experience. So it is, if somebody wants to make their own panels, it's definitely something, or their own treatments, whatever they may be, it's definitely something I think most people can do.
Right on, man. Your dad didn't make you build the shed out back or anything like that?
He did not. No. I mean, he's pretty handy, but we weren't making a lot of things.
It's funny. I'm a little bit similar. My dad, I used to be out there working on my car, and my dad would come and was like, Elijah, I don't know where you got this skill to work on your car. It didn't come from me.
Yeah. Like, and cars, I cannot work on. I can build just about anything, but a car, I'm like, yeah, that looks cool. We should take that somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right on. Well, so, I've got lots of questions for you. Cool. Tell us a little bit about your studio though. I mean, do you still, you left Plus Right Music. I don't know whether that was previous studio or it's still exactly the same one you're running now, or if you sort of have a home studio set up. Tell us what you like to make music in.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, the last 2 years, pretty much, I mixed a record at the beginning of last year. And that was basically the last thing I did, probably recording or mixing wise. It's just been kind of, I work pretty much nonstop on the MCA stuff at this point. But the studio itself, when it is now sort of mostly just sort of a research room, right, or multiple rooms for me at this point. So in its original form, there was 3 tracking rooms. There's like a big live room with vaulted ceilings, or at least big for like a home studio setup. And then I had a piano, like keys room, which had like a 6-foot grand piano in it. So nothing too big, but pretty good size, along with like an old Hammond organ and a Leslie. And then kind of a third, a booth room, mostly for like vocals or acoustic guitar, that kind of thing. And then in the garage, I had built this big like guitar amp isolation box, so we could put cabinets out there. And then really the only 2 rooms in the house that weren't set up for recording were my bedroom and the kitchen, but I did have mic tie lines in the bedroom, so we could put amps or something in there if we needed to. So the whole house was just kind of a studio, and it was laid out. I spent a long time looking for a house that would kind of lend itself to a good setup for that. And so layout wise, everything was pretty good. Had good sight lines to all the rooms except the keys room. So it was a pretty cool setup. I used
When
it
you
for
say
years.
good sightlines, did you actually install studio glass between walls and stuff, or is it more like with doors open, you can just see from one room to another?
No, so like in between the control room, which like was the living room, or what would have been the living room. So like the front door goes into the control room of the studio. And then there was a dining room that's like straight ahead. So if you're looking at the desk, like straight ahead, there was a dining room. I put sliding glass doors in between those two rooms because it was just open before.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So there's sliding glass doors between the control room and the booth. And then I put a window in. So not like studio glass makes it sound better than it is. This is a pretty simple window that I like got from a glass company in town. And built a window out between the big tracking room and the control room. It's not perfectly isolated by any means, but it worked pretty well. It's a thick piece of glass, and I experimented at one point years back with adding another piece of glass and found out the hard way that adding two pieces of glass can make things worse sometimes.
Interesting.
It can definitely help, but you have to do it the right way.
Yeah. I mean, I remember putting in glass in my studio and learning that, one of the things to do is to make sure that each pane of glass is a different width. Because,
like a different depth, thickness, right?
Yeah, different thickness because the glass has a resonant frequency that will let it's like transparent to a certain frequency, might be narrow, but you want, if they're both the same, then it's like just a hole through the wall for a particular frequency, right?
And so that was kind of the miss. So that's like that's called the critical frequency. So it's like at a certain point, it'll just kind of pass right through for whatever reason. It will also be kind of resonant at a lower frequency. So instead of just like letting it go, it'll actually like ring because the two panes are vibrating sympathetically to one another.
Yeah.
It just creates like a drum. But yeah, so using thick glass, I had just gotten lazy and wanted something that I could go pick up that day to try out. So it was it was only there for a couple of days.
Have you seen any examples of so for example, when I changed some windows in my house, it was a guy came over and he did the kind of replace your old windows with new vinyl windows. And I was really struck with how much better the soundproofing was just to the outside with these vinyl windows, which are double pane. And I guess they make triple pane ones. But I don't know if they they probably use the same size pane of glass, I would imagine, or same width, thickness.
Yeah, that I would assume they do. I don't really know. I don't know much about like traditional window construction.
Yeah.
It's also not something that would be super noticeable unless you had like a drum set.
Yeah.
Unless
you got a recording studio.
Yeah. Because it's like, if you were just in there talking, it wasn't noticeable. It was like if somebody was hitting a kick drum, that was like where it was most noticeable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just, these are important things to know. So hopefully we'll get a chance to like hit on a lot of topics today.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's pretty cool. Just remembering that you can stick one of these multi-pane windows can work pretty well, even though it's not perfect. I bet there's tricks you can do too to tone down the glass. I haven't heard anybody talk about this, but I don't see why you couldn't take a bunch of moon gels for drums and just stick them on, take those little, like what the kids' toys are, that go on the glass and stick on it. That would probably help.
Oh, yeah. That would just it's not hard to get different thicknesses of glass. You just like go to any glass company in town and they can do it. And like making a good window, isn't all that complicated. It's just like using two different thicknesses and basically making sure that they're, there's rubber going all the way around them so that they're not making physical contact with your framing.
Yeah. And using acoustic caulk too to seal things.
Yeah. So, either rubber or acoustic caulk, any caulk basically that doesn't harden over time, will work pretty well. So it's not super complicated. You just like avoid, glass that's the exact same depth and that kind of thing. There's definitely some specifics to it as far as like, which type of glass are you using will affect its mass. And so like that, this is all isolation related, but that can affect then like how thick the glass actually should be compared to how you're building your walls. Things that, if you're building a studio are going to be really important. If you're working within, your home studio or the confines of an existing space aren't going to matter that much.
Yeah. Well, so just to kind of close on that thought, when I did build my control room window in my studio, there was a, local glass place in Tennessee that I found. And sure enough, you could just order a piece of glass, a certain size and a certain thickness. And it was a couple of $100 for a sheet of glass, or something like that. So yeah, you could totally choose a couple of different thicknesses and do your own, or, grab some kind of prefab thing that's got multi-panes in it.
Yeah.
Or I don't know if you guys are building windows over there. Are you guys doing glass yet?
We are not, and probably won't be. I built a few custom gobos a couple of years back for a Lehman Drug Company, a studio here in town that had.
Oh yeah, cool place.
Their gobos had windows in them. I think there was 5 or 6.
Yeah.
There were several of them, and so like a couple different sizes, but they each had about 60 pounds of glass in them, and like so those ones were done right. Whereas like two different depths, and both were very thick and very heavy. So I kind of learned from the first window I put in my studio.
Yeah, well, it's cool to hear you talk about the sliding glass door. That's another good reminder, Rockstars, is you can accomplish a lot just by putting in a sliding glass door and a little bit of an air gap and another sliding glass door. And you can separate a couple of rooms pretty well that way for isolation if you need it.
Yeah.
And then we've had somebody else was on recently. We were talking about a really simple method, which was just using a security cam, a one-way security cam that was wired with low latency, and just sticking a screen in the other room. And not even having a window.
Yeah, I mean, now you can do so much with video that like it's nice to be able to have windows, but it's also just because it's easy. But if it's the video stuff's awesome and it's pretty inexpensive these days, and if you are trying to have a really well isolated space, it actually makes that easier.
Yeah. With so many game-changing iZotope plugins to choose from, deciding which one to buy next could be a bit of a challenge. But did you know that now you can have all their plugins through iZotope's new affordable subscription bundle, Music Production Suite Pro, for only $19.99 per month? Get your Rockstar extended 30-day free trial subscription now at iZotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. Do you need to record direct stereo keyboards? Spectra 1964 now offers the Stereo BBDI2 with custom wound high-Z transformers for big headroom, virtually flat response, and a 15 dB input pad. The Spectra 1964 BBDI passive direct box is also perfect for recording deep bass that will make your mixes sound huge. Plug that into a C610 complementer, and as founder Bill Cheney points out, it'll move your pant leg. Get your sound moving at Spectra1964.com. Well, so tell us a little bit more about the control room aspect, because we got lots to talk about as far as these different spaces. But if you've got a pair of speakers set up, what do you set up for monitors in your control room? And just give us, what are we looking at in your control room space? What kind of tools are you surrounded by?
Yeah, I had ATC, I guess I still have them, ATC 25s or the SEM 25s. They're like smaller 3-way speakers that I love. The great monitor. I've had those for probably 3 or so years now. And I think in that time, I've actually become a lot less of a monitor or speaker person. Just because I have put those in different rooms, and I'm like, well, they sound different because the room sounds different. And so it's just kind of like I'm like, I love them, but I'm also much more so. I kind of just work on what you know and what you like and whatever's inspiring in that space. So like in my control room, which is sort of was turned into a big experiment on like how far can you kind of take a home studio setup. The whole room now is like completely built, is like halfway treated because I got through all of the absorption part of it and none of the diffusion part of it. And then actually we started on a demo room. So that's where everything is kind of currently set up. So that used to be like the keyboard room in the studio. So that room's smaller it's 11 by 14 feet. And the main control room is 11 by 17 feet.
That's similar to my control room. I'd almost call that a big home studio control room.
And that is like, for a lot of the, it's a good size. For sure. And so the smaller one I actually think sounds better right now. And that one was all made with like prefabricated panels and things. And but that room has the ATCs in it right now. And then it's got there's very little else in there. So which is kind of helpful, but it's got this desk that I made. Both rooms actually have desks that I made, but one's like a mastering style desk. So it's got a lot of gear in it for when I was tracking a lot. And then the other one holds like 4 rack units, but is slotted. So it's basically like wood slats, so that I was just building something to see if I could make a desk that didn't have any reflection issues.
I feel like I saw that. It was a video that's in the playlist with you and Anders. Yeah. And you're talking about some of the treatments, and there's like wood slatted panels on either side with, and it looked like you had some Atom audio monitors in that shot. But then it did look like the desk also was sort of made out of wood slats, almost like you brought in a bench from the deck, that was just open wood slats.
Pretty much,
the rain doesn't catch on it, and just set that up like a table.
Yeah. It sounds good in there. I've never actually eventually hopefully I'll have time to take measurements and see what it's like with and without it and that kind of thing. So I don't know how well it's really working, but it definitely sounds good in that room.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about some of the basics of positioning and setting stuff up there. So it looked like you had some panels behind the speakers. There's lots to talk about. So let me just start with some basic questions. You're like, how should we set up monitors for mixing in our listening position in the control room? What do you want to say about that?
I think biggest thing in most control rooms is going to be symmetry. So finding a spot in your room where you can be, centered between the left and the right walls. And then typically, kind of a really good starting point is like, and I don't actually know who came up with this, but like being 38% of the length of the room away from the front wall. So if you have a 10-foot room, you'd be like, that's 120. I don't know what 38% of 120 inches is, but like a little over 3 feet, I guess.
Yeah.
That's probably way off.
Yeah. Well, so 30, if it was 100, well, I don't want to just pick random stuff, but just for ease of math.
It's 45 inches away from the front wall.
Okay. All right, cool.
So 38% of 10 feet is 45 inches.
Nice.
So you'd want to sit a little bit less than 4 feet away from the front wall to start with, and then move your monitors around front to back a little bit, move the listening position front to back again. So
we might want to remind the rock stars, don't pick that room for your control room that is a square shape.
Ideally not. Yeah, absolutely. It's, I guess this is a good place to start maybe before we get into where you put your monitors. If you have the option to, most people aren't going to be necessarily building a room, but if you have the option to pick between a couple different rooms, like where your doors are and where the windows are, can play really big role in which one of those rooms will end up sounding better later on.
Yeah. You want symmetry if you can, right?
So yeah, you want symmetry. So you don't want to have a door ideally right at the early reflection point, for your left or your right walls. And doors are very commonly placed in corners of rooms, which then is going to limit how much corner trapping you could potentially do later on. It's not necessarily where you should start, but eventually it's a good place to have something. So if you can avoid a room that does if you can avoid a room that has, doors or windows right in the early reflection points, and then potentially the corners, that's going to really set you up kind of for success later on down the road.
Right. So you're saying that ideally the door, which you got to have unless you're just born in the room and you live your whole life there, you're going to have a door. And you're saying it's best to have those doors on the back wall behind you somewhere, or on the far ends of the side walls?
Yeah. So either in the back half of the room on the side walls is really like the ideal place, or the center of the back wall.
Right.
Which isn't a very common place for a door, but if
makes
you
it
can
hard
find
to put a couch there.
It does make it hard to put a couch there, but if you can find a room that has that and put a couple chairs on like either side of it or something, that can work pretty well too.
Okay, cool. So, all right. So we got a room with the doors towards the back. Now, and it's not square, so that means there's sort of like a long wall and a short wall.
Right.
How does that matter as far as which wall we choose to put our speakers on?
I'd say at least like 9 times out of 10, you're going to want to have your monitors aimed down the long wall. So if your room's 8 feet by 10 feet, set your monitors up to where like, and you and the monitors are on the 10-foot length, basically. So the left and the right width of the room's 8 feet at that point.
Right. So we're staring at the short wall while we work.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And that just, it depends on the size of the room, how much of an impact it's going to make, but it just kind of sets the room up to work better with your monitors for the low end response of the room. Okay.
Good to hear. I'm staring at my monitors and they're set up like that now. So that's good to know.
Yeah.
We're off to a good start.
Most people kind of tend to do that. I don't know if it's just one is normally a better use of the space of the room.
Yeah.
Just layout wise, based off of like how you have a desk and gear and that kind of thing.
Ironically, a really good acoustic setup is terrible feng shui because your back is like not to a wall. Your back is to a wide open room.
Yeah.
Where your friends can sneak up on you
totally.
While you're mixing.
There's very little about acoustics that I'd say lend themselves to being helpful for most other things.
Okay, cool. So, and then what should we talk about next? What's the first consideration for, are we even thinking about treatments yet? Or are we just thinking about where do we sit and where do the speakers sit? And I think you talked a little bit in your video about making it's good to have them on stands, right?
Yeah. If at all possible, put your monitors on stands for a couple of reasons. One, that helps limit some of the issues that you'll have with reflections off your desk because you can position them in a better way. But most importantly, the control that we really have in terms of like sort of tuning a room or tuning your monitors, because you're not really doing that. You're just sort of moving things around to find the most optimal spot for them. But it's really hard to fine tune the placement of your monitors if they're on your desk because you're so limited in being able to move them front to back.
Right.
You don't have any control really over how far away you are from your monitors. So the only thing at that point you can do is either move your entire desk, which then moves your listening position, or angle your monitors a little bit. And where your monitors are going to be, like how far apart your monitors are, so how wide they are, and then how far back you are from your monitors. Both of those things can have a massive impact on the sound of your room, particularly in the low end. So you can really fine tune what you're hearing at the listening position based off of where your listening position is, and then based where your monitors are. And if they're not on stands, you're basically cutting off 80% of your ability to do that.
Yeah. And then I guess we should say that if they are on stands, ideally the stands will make the tweeter height of your speakers at ear level, right?
Yeah. So that's a great point. So super important to either have monitors that match, just happen to like work with whatever the height of your monitors are, so that the tweeter is at ear height or just slightly above it. Or getting stands that are height adjustable. It's definitely not the most fun thing to buy. Expensive monitor stands that have an adjustable height and that are super heavy, but it is incredibly important and helpful if you want to have the ability to really fine tune your room and control how things are sounding in there.
And then on the cheaper end of the scenario, potentially Rockstars, if your chair can go up and down just a little bit, that could also help just adjust your ear until you hit the right height. But of course, ergonomically, you want to make sure that, you're able to work at your desk and it's not awkward. Atom Audio can provide all your monitor needs. Whether you are setting up a first-time home studio for recording music or podcasts, or a world-class studio for professional mixing and mastering, their unique accelerated ribbon tweeter design is famous for creating smooth, detailed imaging that let your speakers disappear into your music, allowing you to focus on the mix. Visit the Atom Audio YouTube channel for lots of cool free interviews, tutorials, masterclasses, and learn how to set up your studio monitors and control room. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode. The JZ Microphone Vintage Series are built by hand in Latvia and feature the patented Golden Drop capsule design for enhanced clarity that will give your recordings that classic vintage tone. Our friends at JZ Microphones have come up with a special offer only available to you, Recording Studio Rockstars listeners. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the V67, V47, or the new V12 microphone at JZ Mike.com. Let me back up. Let me ask a dumb question that I haven't asked yet. It just occurred to me to ask it. Why do we give a shit about any of this? Like, why do we need to, if somebody's like, what do I get? Like, my speakers are just on my desk. They're right there. I hear them. Let's crank that up and make some tracks. Why might we want to care about setting up monitors properly, and what might be, the result of having really good monitoring? What kind of transformation? I know that's a big word, big heavy word there, but what transformation might we experience by setting up our monitoring properly in our studio?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, like, I'm not a big monitor or speaker person anymore, and it's because, like, they're all made so well. They're all relatively flat and are going to give you a really good picture and idea of what's happening. Rooms are the complete opposite. They're all basically going to cause massive distortions to what you're hearing. And
not the kind of massive distortion you pay a lot for in a guitar pedal, rock.
No, not at all. Not great sounding distortion through a guitar pedal or an amp or anything, or any fun piece of tube gear. They are just huge frequency distortions. So, big peaks in the low end, or even in high end, wherever it is, like, they're just making whatever your monitors are trying to tell you. Your room is like, hey, that's nice and all, but we're actually going to show you this other thing.
Right.
And so you have a really hard time hearing what's happening, which then makes, making judgments on EQ, compression, balance, most importantly, reverb, anything that you're working on, whether it's, mixing or writing or producing something part-wise, like what makes the most sense, what feels good. All of those things are really hard to do when your brain's constantly being distracted by all the inaccuracies that you're hearing. And so things, sound weird. And all that really ends up doing is limiting how creative and free you can kind of be with the music that you're working on. And so it makes it more tiring. It makes it to where everything takes longer. And ultimately, I kind of always tell people, like, you're, at the end of the day, like, you're still you. So, like, whatever you hear in your head, you're probably going to get there regardless of how good your room is. But
right, because you're going to push for it.
Right, but you'll be able to get there 4 times as fast. You won't be tired, and you'll be able to do a lot more and be more creative if you have a room that you can trust. And so all it's really doing is just making you a better version of yourself, or better at what you're doing.
That's exciting. I like that idea. I like when we feel like we can work quickly in the studio, and I like when we feel like you can, do something, get it, move on to something else. Because I feel like musically our brains work that way. We don't really want to be stuck on the same, thinking about the same 3 notes and chord for ages and ages. We just want to, like, experience it, move on to the next thing.
Right. Well, I mean, it's hard to work creatively and, be in the moment and be inspired if you're constantly going back to, like, well, is there this weird resonance in the guitar, or is that just the room telling me that there is?
Yeah. Or who cares? Let's just get a good guitar sound and move on.
And so, the better your room's treated and sounds, the more responsive you can be to how things feel.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts that come to mind talking about this: the positioning of where you're sitting and the speakers, near and from the wall, and whether or not they're on stands or the desktop. those are things that seem to, on one level, they affect the frequency response of what you're hearing, which means that decisions about whether there's too much or too little of a particular frequency, EQ choices, things like that will be affected. So this is going to help make smarter choices by getting these things right. Another, when we talk about like tweeter height and stuff like that, even though that's also about frequency, hearing the high end and things, is, you have this idea of imaging and creating a phantom image in the center where you can hear something that's, you describe basics again. So something that's panned up the middle, all that means is that, the vocal, if it's in the middle, is coming out of the left and the right speaker, hopefully at equal volume with equal frequency response, so that when you close your eyes, you just hear that vocal floating right in the center of the mix. And if your imaging is off, it makes it hard probably to set a vocal level, probably because you're not sure about how it's sitting. But also it makes panning challenging because you just don't really hear. I almost feel like you would default to left, center, right only if you can't really hear subtleties in panning. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I think I think people, you'd probably just kind of use left, center, right if it's like, hey, I don't, what's the difference between 45 and 55 if you can't hear it, and so why use it?
Right.
It's also, I think, just distract. Like I've had times where I've been in rooms and like the left side will be a couple dB louder than the right side, or just, or something's just slightly off. Like,
but you were in my old studio?
No, I haven't been.
No, I'm serious. But kidding aside, I mean, like there's so many times where I've been frustrated. I'm like, I'll pan a background vocal over to the left speaker, and then I'm like, set a level, and then I pan it over to the right, and I'm like, wait a minute, why does it sound different now?
Yeah, but it's just really distracting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to me, it always just kind of comes back to like, all those things are just limiting how well you can, do whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's producing or mixing or.
Right. I'd rather be making a next musical decision than
totally
spending energy wondering whether or not something's right or not.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving forward, so there's a good reason to get your speakers set up really well so that you can make great mixing decisions, so you can make the right choices, and best of all, so that you can make them quickly and move on to the next thing. So now that kind of brings us back to where I cut you off so rudely and took you back in that direction.
No.
Where do you think we left off? We were sort of talking about speaker position.
Yeah. So it's like,
height.
Where would you set up? How would you set up in the room? Should your monitors be on speakers, which they definitely should be,
or on stands, on speaker stands.
On stands. Yeah. Yes. The one last thing, I guess, sort of along these lines, is the other thing you don't want to do is put your computer monitor on your desk, because that will put your monitor in between you and your speakers, which will then create all sorts of weird filtering problems and other distortions. So it's super, it doesn't have to be mounted on the wall. They make stands that freestanding stands that you can put a computer monitor on that are really inexpensive. There's a lot of like easy solutions to that, but that's kind of the last setup thing. If at all possible, put your speakers on stands, put your computer monitor behind your speakers, and then have as small a desk as possible would be the other thing.
Yeah. And then, as far as the computer monitor thing goes, just a reminder, Rockstars, it's like, if you take the computer monitor you're used to having right in front of your face and you move it 4.5 feet away from you, you might go like, well, how am I supposed to see it? Well, just now it's so easy to just pick up a bigger TV and just hang it on the wall and use that as your monitor. Are there any considerations we need to be aware of as far as that goes? Or is that a pretty good solution? Just, run an HDMI cable over and use the TV as a monitor?
That works well. Yeah, I think, find it, just if you're using a TV, find one that, resolution wise will work okay as a computer screen. Sometimes that can be, I don't know if that's still a problem. I had tried this a few years ago and I went through two, so it wasn't complicated, but I think, they all work well.
Well, the resolution's getting better on TVs now.
Yeah. And it only mattered with text. So it's not a big deal. I think the other thing would be, don't necessarily go as big as possible. Go as big as you need to see it.
So I'm in that situation now. I've got a 55-inch screen in front of me. And with this current setup, which is actually temporary for me, my speakers actually toe in front of the screen. And I was like, oh crap, I can't see the edges. So I had to go into the settings and find the shrinking function to actually shrink the image down on the TV. But that is a point worth bringing up, which you might appreciate, Rockstars. With the TV stuff, one of the issues I found that I was running into a little bit is the TV, because it has this built-in processing to try and smooth out movies and things like that, that can potentially add latency to the responsiveness. So the quick solution is go into the settings, and every kind of auto setting for that you can find, try turning it off and see if it sort of gives you a quicker response and feel. Because if it's having to do some thinking and processing, it might make your mouse feel like it's lagging a little bit.
Gaming, most TVs have a gaming mode. Mm-hmm. That will also help with that.
Right. It's meant to be quick and responsive. Yeah. The gamers always get it before the pro audio guys do, but we'll take advantage of it. Okay, cool. So monitors on the back wall, speakers on stands. You were starting to talk about the desk.
Monitors
itself.
On the long wall.
I'm sorry, I just said that all wrong, didn't I? No, let me back up. The computer monitor is on the wall, or it's on a stand.
Gotcha.
The speakers are on stands, and you were just starting to talk about the desk itself.
Yeah. And there's not much to say about the desk other than like the smaller the desk, the better. Depending on what you're doing in your studio, that doesn't always necessarily make a lot of sense workflow wise. Mm-hmm. But kind of a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. And then from there, it's really kind of treating the rest of the room, because now you're at a point where your monitors, your listening position, your desk, and your computer monitor all working well to give you as much flexibility as possible.
Yeah, let me drop in a comment. You're going to be like, what is this, a Lid show? Come on, man, this is the Graham show. No. But you're just sparking all these ideas, and I'm remembering things. So when it comes to the desk, I remember hearing, like even back in school, they would talk about like, put your monitors behind the meter bridge so that they don't reflect off the console. And I'd hear stuff like that. I'm like, really? You think about your experience listening to speakers and you'd feel like, I don't hear anything, But then I remember putting up a mic and shooting out my room at one point, and I tried that. My NS10s, when they were set up, they sort of reflected down off the console up and to my face. Mm-hmm. And, there was there was an angle like that. And then I thought, I wonder what would happen if I just took like a 703 panel and put it on the desktop to just block that one reflection and absorb it. And sure enough, there was like in the measurement, I watched this 250 dip flatten out.
Yeah, it can make a huge difference.
So, and then you think about that, Rockstars, that 250 range, that's what, a lot of times we think of that as like the muddy zone in a mix. And if your speakers, if there's a dip off your desk or console, then you're going to think you've got clarity in a mix when it's not there. And then you take it out somewhere else and listen. You're like, why does it sound so lumpy and muddy?
Yeah. And so it's just, we're kind of used to hearing, at least if you've, been in studios with consoles or that kind of thing, we're all pretty used to hearing some sort of reflection off the desk, but limiting it as much as possible just adds clarity to your monitoring. It'll help improve stereo imaging. It makes things better. So the smaller the desk can be, the better.
The STX-100D from the Spectra 1964 Custom Shop is the big brother to the now famous STX-100, a fully discrete mic pre with dual transformer isolated Spectra 101 amplifiers. The STX-100D is exactly the same original circuit found in Stax, Ardent, Advision, A&M, and Record Plant recording consoles. The sonic performance is identical. Best of all, it will plug into a single space of your standard 500 500 lunchbox. And if you want to add the sound of the famous Spectra C610 complementer, then check out the new STX 600 modules, combining the STX 100 mic pre and C610 into a single 500 module. Now you can get the same incredible sound in your studio that worked for famous producers like Tom Dowd with the STX mic pre's BBDI and complementers. Go to Spectra1964.com or call 801-797-0642. I love using iZotope plugins for my music and podcast productions. In fact, you're hearing Ozone and RX on my voice in this podcast episode. And now you can get access to all the iZotope plugins through the new subscription bundle. For only $19.99 per month, Music Production Suite Pro is designed for the serious recording, mixing, and mastering engineer, putting the finishing touches on music, film, and podcasts with fully pro versions of Ozone, RX, Neutron, Nectar, Neoverb, Tonal Balance Control, Visual Mixer, and more, including free plugin updates. And just for you rock stars, get an extended 30-day free trial subscription at iZotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. Coupon not valid for subscription. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Graham Wax, joining us from Music City Acoustics to talk about sound treatments for your home studio. Graham, are you ready to jam? That rhymes.
Yeah.
Awesome, dude. Well, so let's start talking about, what is sound treatment? I mean, I guess the first thing that you hear people say is like, man, we really need to soundproof this studio. What do we need to know about that topic?
So that kind of opens up a whole can of worms and it's just sort of a issue with, I think, within not even the industry of music, just kind of acoustics, soundproofing and then acoustic treatment, which is typically what we're talking about for like a home studio setup, are two very different things. Soundproofing or isolation is, how are your walls built? Are you going to hear sound from your live room to your control room or sound from outside to inside your house? And that's like, where your walls built to decouple the interior structure from the outer structure, as well as the floor and the ceiling. What kind of doors are you using? Windows, are they all sealed really well? Those kinds of things. And then
soundproofing is sound traveling through the walls.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So like, is it actually, basically vibrating itself through that structure and then out into another room? And then acoustics or acoustic treatment is all meant to deal and address the sound within the room. So are things, in a control room, you want a really even frequency response and decay time. In a live room, you're going to want things to be controlled, but you basically just don't want things to be too echoey or too reverberant, and you want a pretty even response throughout the frequency spectrum. If you're just dealing with an office, it's really just how do you limit echo so that you can improve speech intelligibility, or in a podcast studio, same kind of thing.
I was going to ask you described your home studio when you had it, and you had all these special rooms, and then you said, and then there was the bedroom. And I was curious if you left your bedroom intentionally untreated and you'd like go in and just like this sigh of relief that everything sounded terrible in your bedroom at the end of the day. You're like,
Intentionally, no, but there is no treatment. There's a bed in there. There's no treatment. Right on.
Okay, so keep going. Continue, my friend.
Yeah. So from a soundproofing standpoint, like there's not really soundproofing products there because it's all construction based as far as like how is something going to be built. Right. But there's a ton of acoustic treatment products. The most basic kind of thing is like your normal acoustic panel, which is some sort of absorptive material, and then they're normally wrapped in fabric. There's also different things that are like perforated wood, which absorb in a slightly different way.
Oh, these are all sound treatments. Right?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yeah. It's like acoustic treatment, sound treatments, and then
soundproofing is essentially heavy construction decisions.
Right. Yeah. It's all construction based.
Yeah. Right.
And then so you've got acoustic panels, bass traps. Bass traps aren't really a specific thing. It's kind of like a common term. But a bass trap is really just anything that's intended to absorb or has the ability to absorb lower frequencies. So there's
how low is reasonable to even consider?
It depends on what it is. So for a like 6-inch, if you have a 2-inch panel, and this is where home studios can get tricky. So you really need depth to absorb low frequencies. There are specific like Helmholtz resonators or membrane traps, and you can use those. But if you're dealing with 30 hertz, they still have to be really basically a couple feet deep or just shy of that to absorb that well. If you're dealing with a normal like acoustic panel type thing, so a porous absorber or velocity absorber, just standard panel, you can get a 6-inch panel to absorb pretty effectively all the way down to like 50, 60 hertz. But it needs a lot of air to do that. And so
what is a 6-inch panel? Is that 6 inches deep of insulation?
6 inches deep. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And you can make them deeper, if we're doing custom rooms or builds, anything like that. In my control room, I've got the corners and the back wall's 1.5 feet deep, and the corners are like 3 feet deep at the deepest point. And so you can go way bigger than that. The way that you do that can change. So in order to like really absorb down into the low frequencies and where things get complicated, like really complicated or really hard, is below 100 hertz.
Right.
For the most part.
You mean where all the problems live?
Yeah. There's definitely some problems like above that, but most panels, most acoustic treatment products, whoever makes them, whatever they are going to work pretty well. As long as it's at least 4 inches thick from like 300 hertz and up.
As long as we keep making more and more bass music, that problem keeps getting worse.
Yeah, exactly. So the tricky area for every room is always the low end, and it's just a matter of space and like how much room can you give up for your acoustic treatments, basically. There's not really a way around that because the sound's coming out of your speakers, and it needs something to stop it. Otherwise, it just stays in the room and it builds up, and that's why things in the low end can sound soft and muddy and lack definition. And that's, it just makes it hard to really tell what's going on, which means you're going back and forth to the car all the time.
Right. So do we need to break up the way we're thinking about sound treatment into low frequencies and like upper frequencies?
I would actually say no, because in a home studio setting, or let's say at least for a smaller studio, anything from like, I don't know, 17 by 11 and smaller, you don't really have enough room to think about them all that separately.
Okay.
So there's nowhere in that room that's going to benefit from having like a 2-inch deep panel as opposed to a 6-inch deep panel. And so, how you position them, I was saying earlier, like you need air behind those panels. So that applies to the panels on your sidewall. So even if you're treating an early reflections don't only happen at like high frequencies. So you ideally would treat that with a deeper panel, for at least 4 inches deep, is for a control room type space is always what I would recommend. Going thinner than that is just really going to limit how effective they're going to be at lower frequencies. And so there's not really a reason to break them up because you don't have the ability to. It's like one of the reasons that like membrane traps can work really well, but in a small room, membrane traps or Helmholtz resonators are only addressing one problem. And a porous absorber is like a normal panel. That just means like there's 703 or mineral wool or like recycled denim, whatever the absorbent material is. Those are going to address all frequencies. So you can do things to then like control how much of the high frequency range they're absorbing so that you don't overdo it. But as a whole, we're basically, from in that setting, typically just using broadband absorbers.
So we're talking about those front corners of the wall.
Yeah. Well, I was actually talking about like the side walls, like your early reflection points.
All right.
So you would want, treat those with a 6-inch deep panel. And then if you have room for it, put that 6 inches off the wall. So there's a 6-inch air gap. That means you're losing a foot of your room. So very quickly, you can see where that isn't necessarily feasible in every room.
Right.
Because you're going to do that on both sides. And then you lost 2 feet. It adds up quick. But as a whole, it's not so much of like high frequency, low frequencies. How do we, treat this. There's certain areas where you're treating, if you are treating the corners, that's more of a low frequency issue. But in a small room, again, you're so close to that corner in proximity that there's also high frequency concerns there.
Right.
And so it just isn't really, there's not like a clear cut, like here's where your high frequencies are a problem and here's where your low frequencies are a problem. And these are going to be treated in different ways. We're kind of addressing all of it at once.
All right. Well, so give us some go-to approaches to, setting up basic treatment in a home studio control room.
So, kind of first and foremost, and this is going to be the early reflections. There's no kind of crazy secret there. I think that the biggest thing I would point out, like I was saying, is that using a deeper panel there whenever possible with an air gap is going to be super important. And if you're, so if you're using a 6-inch deep panel, if you can make the air gap 6 inches, awesome. If you're using a 4-inch panel, make the air gap 4 inches. You kind of want to match it to the depth of the panel. There's a couple areas where that changes, but if it's just a panel on the wall, that's how I would recommend approaching it.
And how do we know where to put those panels?
Early reflections are always basically, like, at least the side walls are always going to fall somewhere between the monitor and the listening position. Mm-hmm. And so if you have there's the mirror trick. You can also use your phone if it's got a camera on it and you don't have a mirror.
Wait, so how would you use the phone camera? You just put it in selfie mode or something? Yeah.
So you put it in selfie mode so you can see the screen. And then just slide that along the same way you would use a mirror. So the phone or the mirror slides along the wall while you have friends holding it. And then you're sitting at the listening position. And then wherever you can see your monitor, is going to be like your first reflection point.
So you might slide it toward you until you don't see the monitor, and then like draw a little line on the wall with the pencil, and then slide it toward the speaker side of the wall, until you don't see the speaker, and draw a little pencil, and then just cover that whole part of the wall if you could. Although I guess it gets tricky because you've got a panel that's a certain size, so you're just trying to like center it just right.
I would and in a perfect world, you're hopefully not using just one panel for that spot because it's a little bit bigger than like what the mirror is showing you.
Okay, so a couple of panels side by side.
So you can have like two panels on your left and your right. And I had like this while we're talking about this, I have an article that I wrote that like I can send to you that sort of breaks down exactly how to do this and where to treat them.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes.
And it's super helpful just in terms of figuring out like how to lay out your room, where to start with treatment. So sidewall early reflections. You also have early reflections off of the front wall and the ceiling in the back wall, really. So you can do the same trick with all of those surfaces. And one thing to keep in mind with your back wall is that like your early reflections are the first reflections off your back wall, and the most prominent and strong ones are not in the middle of the room. They're more towards the left and the right sides of that wall because that's where your monitors are aimed.
Okay, cool. And then I was just picturing, you said the ceiling, you can do the same trick. So I before Rockstars, you get up on stools and fall over onto your console and start breaking things. Just remember, he said you can use an iPhone in selfie mode and just get a selfie stick and extend it up to the ceiling and just scoot it along for somebody else who's sitting there. You could probably do it for yourself, in fact.
Yeah, you can also, if you're treating the ceiling, the panels will ideally cover your monitor and your head at the listening position.
Yeah.
If you don't have panels, if your listening area's got a greater depth than whatever the length of your panels is, just put like you want them above your head still. So put them, a little bit closer to you and in between your monitors and your listening position. So like like that's where it's going to be. They're never going to end up behind you. They're not going to end up way in front of you. So you can, if there's stuff in the way, you can skip the mirror trick for that one.
Now, if the ceiling cloud is hanging down, and essentially it's just panels hanging above your head is what it is, right? But if the ceiling cloud is hanging down, does it make sense, if there's that extra room above it to go like, oh, I'll just stuff more pink insulation above it? Or is that just sort of a messy,
you
unnecessary?
but it's not going to make a huge difference there.
Okay. All right, cool.
It's just like you're better off having. There's some areas where so in a corner, you don't really want the panel in the corner, and so like on the internet, if super chunks, like the idea of cutting triangles and sticking them in your corners is very common and popular.
Good or bad?
More on the bad side than on the good side, unless they're really big. And I know this because I did this in literally every corner of my control room years ago, like all of the ceiling to wall ones, all the vertical ones, and it did not help at all fix what I was trying. I was basically trying to fix the floor to ceiling mode. My control room's got an 8-foot ceiling, and that means like 100 in the like 130, 140 range. Mm-hmm. There's just like this huge booming sound. If you're at the list, if you're sitting down in a chair, doesn't matter where you are in the room. And I couldn't figure out what it was. I tried just about everything you could think of, except just putting in a cloud that was 6 inches deep, which would have fixed it immediately. So it just meant anytime somebody was playing like a C or a B, it was very, very boomy and very loud.
Right. So thinking about it, actually, it's funny because the super chunk corner thing would really affect the length of the room more than the ceiling height, because only at the floor level and at the ceiling level is it where all the ceiling modes come together, and everywhere in between going up the wall is sort of in the no man's land of those modes, right?
Right. And it also, what it does is it affects the decay time more than the frequency response of the room. And basically there's two problems. One, like super chunks in terms of how they're typically talked about just isn't very effective, because people are normally like cut a 17 by 17 by 24 inch triangle and then shove that in your corner.
Right. And stack them up.
It's just way too small. So if you're much better off just taking an acoustic, like a broadband, like a 4-inch deep or 6-inch deep panel, and straddling that corner. Because that means that panel is actually starting. I don't know if I'm going to be able to explain this well. The panel, that panel doesn't fit into the corner. So it's 17 inches. The back of that panel is 17 inches from the corner on each side, which means it's starting in the room where your quote unquote like super chunk was finishing, right? Or at least like it's the distance from the wall. I probably didn't say that very well, but there's no air behind a super chunk. And the way that all of these absorbing panels or bass traps or whatever you want to call them are working is by absorbing air particles as they're moving. Mm-hmm. So the air particles just vibrate back and forth against each other. They don't do that up against a wall. So they start to move really slowly there. So there's not a whole lot of energy to absorb. There's a ton of pressure, but that's because the pressure is building up because they're not moving. And so if you're using a membrane trap or a Helmholtz resonator, that's where you want it. You want it in those high pressure zones. You do not want an acoustic panel in a high pressure zone because there's no velocity. There's no actual movement, and there's nothing for them to do.
And high pressure zone means literally like right on the surface of the wall.
Yeah. So that's why anytime that is where low frequencies build up. That's where all your modes terminate. So if you go to a corner or you go to the back wall, it's very easy to hear all of a sudden that you have more low end. But if you put a panel flush up against the wall, it's just, there's nothing for it to absorb, because it's not the way that panel works. There's no energy there for it to actually absorb.
Cool.
That's so it's like you can make a 4 or 6 inch panel work pretty well, even though they're not that deep. You just have to get them off the wall or away from the ceiling or the floor, whatever the surface is.
Yeah. And I like your tip of saying like whatever the depth of the panel is, that's how far off the wall it should be.
Yeah. And so the one area where that kind of changes potentially is a corner, because then you can get way more air without losing a lot of space in your room.
Okay,
so
cool.
You can straddle it. You can set the panel to where it's if you have a 4 by 2 foot panel, you can either do that where it's 4 feet by 2 feet tall. Sorry, it's 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide. Mm-hmm. And so there's like a 1 foot air gap behind the panel in the middle. Or you can make it to where it's 4 feet wide and 2 feet tall, and then stack multiple panels. And then all of a sudden you've got like 2.5 foot air gap or so behind your panel.
Now, would you put anything in the air gap? Would you, paint insulation or something like that?
So going back to your question, then it's a great time to put like fluffy insulation back there, because fluffy insulation will do a really good job of absorbing low frequencies. And again, like the corners aren't going to create a huge frequency response change in your room, but they're going to create a really big decay time change in your room. And adding the fluffy insulation behind a panel will help further that.
It's fascinating. And one of the things that I feel like I began to notice as I started to make my studio more efficient, things like filling my speakers stands with sand so that they were more rigid. I even put garden pavers on top of my NS10s at one point, and put heavy vinyl underneath them and stuff. So it's just decoupling, sort of making them rigid and decoupling. And the sound got tighter sounding, but I also noticed that I needed to kind of turn up my speakers more.
Right.
And I think that's a thing that we may begin to notice too. It's like when everything's echoey and loud, it's like you can go into a big echoey room and talk and your voice seems really loud because it's echoey. It's like a loud restaurant. So just an observation.
Yeah, that is interesting, because oddly enough, one of the things that normally happens when you put a lot of like bass traps in a room, or you start absorbing a lot of low end in a room, is the low end actually feels louder, because it's all of a sudden it's more even. So you don't have like these really big peaks at certain frequencies. And as things even out and get more defined, you actually hear more of it instead of less of it. Even though you're absorbing a lot of stuff, you're just making things even and more accurate. And so you hear more of it. It's
canceling itself less, maybe even.
Right. And the other kind of going back to like the ATCs that I have, the monitors, they're an incredibly low distortion monitor. And it always feels like they're quieter than like any other speaker.
It makes sense. I mean, we use saturation to make things sound apparently louder.
Yeah. So I love them, but if you're like, if you're tracking a band or you're in a tracking session and somebody wants something turned up really loud, you have to turn it up twice as much.
Right. Look, every studio needs a good vintage mic for that classic warm sound. Whether you're looking for those airy highs, sweet mid-range, or silky low-end, a good vintage mic can put the magic in your mixes. So it's no wonder vintage mics have been loved and praised by thousands of engineers for decades. The JZ Microphone Vintage series are built by hand in Latvia, using only the best electronic components, and feature the patented Golden Drop capsule design for great detail and richness of tone that will bring that classic vintage vibe to your studio and be a real workhorse for your sessions. This time, our friends at JZ Microphones have come up with a special offer only available to you, Rockstars. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the vintage series mics V67, V47, and the new V12 at jzmic.com. Adam Audio designs monitors with a mission to bring accuracy, transparency, and high definition to your studio, guiding you each step of the way on your journey from starting out in a home studio to installing your ultimate mixing setup in your pro studio. Check out their complete line of speakers and headphones, from the T-Series to the AX Series to their top-of-the-line S-Series, which all use the unique ART-accelerated ribbon tweeter design, famous for creating smooth, detailed imaging that let your speakers disappear into your music. Want to feel awesome to make brilliantly accurate creative decisions in your mixes because you can finally hear your music clearly? Your ears are the greatest instrument you have, and if you can hear the music, then you can mix the music. Visit the Adam Audio YouTube channel for lots of cool free interviews, tutorials, masterclasses, and learn how to set up your studio monitors and control room. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode. Okay, cool. Let's talk a little bit more about modes, which we kind of glossed over.
Okay.
What are room modes? How's it related to a Coke bottle? And what do we want to know about best room ratios?
So room modes are the every room, just the dimensions of it will kind of dictate which frequency that the room's going to resonate at. And that's just, if you have a kind of going back to like the 8-foot ceiling in my studio, or in the control room, that coincides with like 140 hertz or right around there. And that means at that frequency, the room's amplifying that sound. And then at other frequencies, depending on where it falls on the wavelength, it's going to cancel out and then, amplify again other frequencies. It's all math based. It's just sort of like what's the length of your room, which frequency has that wavelength, and then that's the frequency that you have a room mode at. And so your room's resonating at certain frequencies and then not at others, and you get these really big imbalances if you don't kind of treat that and even it out. And so the way the Coke bottle, I think like it's helpful to kind of use a Coke bottle reference in that if you have a glass Coke bottle and you've had half of it, or you drink half of it, and you blow air through the top of that, it's going to make like a whistling sound. Yeah. At a
that was
frequency.
Me faking it. I don't really have a Coke bottle here.
And then if you drink a little bit more of it, and that frequency is going to go down.
We're not encouraging you to drink Coke, rock stars. Just putting that.
No, you can do this with a Topo Chico bottle.
There you
go. But whatever bottle works. That it's more so just the concept of like you're changing the length. But like if that in this example, if the Coke bottle or the Topo Chico bottle is your room, the more of it you drink, the longer your room's getting, and then the frequency that bottle's resonating at is going down. Right. And so your room is just going to affect certain frequencies more than others based off of its dimensions. And so you have certain frequencies that are really loud and other frequencies that aren't. And one aspect of that, or one aspect of the acoustics of your room, are room modes. They're
right. And each dimension has its own set of modes. So the length of the room has certain resonances. The width has certain resonances. The floor to ceiling has certain resonances.
Right. And so that's why like you want to avoid sitting in the middle of your room, like front to back. For the width of your room, we've just kind of accepted like that's the best place to sit. You'll deal with the room mode problem of like, or sitting in the null of a room mode at that point. But like front to back, you never want to sit in the middle of your room.
You mean like my mix setup used to be?
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, I got a pretty big console, and I got sick of sitting, so I put in a standing desk, which pushed me back even further until one day I was like, I think I'm actually trying to do everything from exactly halfway in the room, which is a terrible spot to be.
Yeah, and so that's all mode related, and then there's multiple modes for the width, length, and height of your room, and then you have modes that are interacting between two walls, and then or two services, and then or actually four, and then six. And so it gets more and more complicated. But the more walls they involve, the less energy they actually have. So they're not nearly as big of a problem as like your front to back or left to right or floor to ceiling modes.
Right. And the distribution of those big modal peaks between the length, width, and height, the way that those lay out and land on different frequencies, my understanding is that what you would consider a best room ratio is one that seems to disperse those most evenly, even though there's no such thing as like perfectly even. They can be dispersed in such a way that they don't sort of pile up on each other and really exaggerate the peaks or exaggerate the dips too much.
Right. Yeah. And so, if you, I think it's roommodecalculator.com, I think is the website, which is really cool if like people want to put their room into it. Okay. Or if you type in room mode calculator, you'll find it. There's it's like, what is the name of this company? It's I don't even know if it's a company. It's like amacoustics.com is the website, or Amrock. And you can put in the dimensions of your room, and it'll show you kind of the room mode the mode distribution of it, where they are in frequency. It also shows you, and this is kind of what you were talking about, like per octave band, how many modes you have. And so what happens if you have like a cube is you will have you'll have like way more modes in one octave band than you do in the one above or below it. And that creates this really weird imbalance in your room. So you have like a decay time, of like 1.5 seconds at 100 hertz, and then a decay time of 0.2 seconds at 150 hertz. That's a weird exaggeration of it, but that's essentially what's happening. It's like the room's just massively amplifying certain frequencies.
But it's interesting. It's a reminder because I tend to think about it as louder, softer frequencies, but you're reminding us that it's not only that, but it's like, how long do those frequencies resonate and hang around for?
Yeah. So like room modes are very important, and like, but it's much more so kind of like they impact where you sit and like, so where you set up. And so when you have your speakers on stands, you can control, are you sitting, because as you move throughout your room, the effects of those modes at some points are going to be really significant, and other points aren't really going to be distorting things that much.
Yeah.
And so you can optimize where you sit and where you put your speakers to limit the effects, at least from the frequency response of what you're hearing, at the listening position. What you can't really do is affect or control through the decay time of your room.
Right. Okay, cool. And but so that's where the panels come in.
That's where the panels come in. And then the other thing that really affects your frequency response is going to be like reflections off of the wall. So, speaker boundary interference, which is just like a fancy way of saying sound bounces off the wall, comes back to you at the listening position, and then distorts things. So, that's kind of the whole concept of comb filtering and treating your early reflections.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're getting a sound hitting your ear, and then you're getting the same sound with a delay, and it cuts some frequencies out and boosts others, and you get the comb filter.
Yeah. And in smaller rooms, or most home studios, all of your walls are typically really close to you. There's never like a time where you're 30 feet away and the reflection off of that wall is so low that it's below the audible hearing spectrum.
Now, if you're like me and you've been losing your hair for a long time because you're a rock star and you're really cool, does that mean that you're immune to the comb filtering effect because you just don't use
it? Does not, unfortunately.
Dang it.
Doesn't help you.
There was hope for all of us rock stars.
It may mean you're just better at ignoring it, though.
No, but I've seen your videos, man. You still got hair. You take the combs.
Yes, luckily I still do.
So what's the difference between treatment for the mix room and treatment for the live rooms where the instruments are? You talked about a piano room in your studio, a sort of a drum room with vaulted ceiling, a vocal booth. How should we start thinking about those rooms, and how do we know when the treatment is appropriate for those? Or when it's not appropriate? We can assume it's not appropriate right now when we start out with an empty house, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, live rooms are fun because there's a control room, you have a pretty set target. Like, kind of, at least the range based off the size of the room and, where you want things to be. Control rooms are very dependent on, are you just recording vocals in a live room, and that kind of thing. And so you don't really want a lot of room sound, or are you potentially recording strings or a string section, or drums or something that's going to benefit from a more live sounding space. And so with that, you can kind of then determine the best approach to treating it as a whole. Ideally the decay time will always be fairly even from the high end to the low end of the frequency spectrum. But you can get away with a lot more in a live room.
It's like in the live room, it's okay to hear the room as long as you like that instrument,
because
right?
Things move around. So if you have a drum set in one spot and it sounds bad, and then you move it to a different spot, it might sound great.
Do you find that you find it useful in studio setups and designs when you help people figure out how to treat their live rooms, that it's more effective to say, let's make this end of the room dead and this end of the room live? Or does that only apply in certain kind of studio sizes, for example?
Not so much. I mean, that's definitely a common thing. And I don't think it's as common so much now, but I think like live and dead end used to be pretty common. It's funny.
Again, I don't mean control room. I mean in the
I know. I mean in live rooms. It's every time I've seen it in a studio, they say they don't use it, or they never use it how they thought they would. And so it's not like I've never approached a room that way, because I'd rather have gobos or something that can move.
Right.
And so you can just kind of control so that you're not forced to use, to always set up your room in one way. That way you can just kind of have having a movable panel, even just with a piece of wood screwed to the bottom of it so it's movable. Gobos don't have to be complicated.
Do you find gobos are almost always about controlling the reverb time and lowering it as you sort of like gobo off an instrument and block it from other things? Or have you found really effective gobo situations where you're taking a room that's kind of got a nice control to it, and then you bring in all these hard surfaces around an instrument to sort of reliven it back up?
Kind of both. So I think gobos first and foremost, like if you're tracking a horn section or a string section and there's multiple people and you're actually miking those individual instruments, you might put a gobo between each of them so there's less bleed, or even a vocalist and an acoustic guitar. So there's less like direct bleed into each of those mics. So it's less of a room sound thing and more of just what sound is getting into your microphone.
Right.
So kind of partitioning off a room or microphones. And then from there, beyond that, it can be both. If let's say you're recording a drum set and for one song as a whole, you're in a pretty live room, and then you want a really tight, dry sound for one song. And so you can bring in gobos or movable panels or whatever you have around and bring them in really close to the drum so you're not hearing a lot of the room and you're really limiting the reflections in the room sound that's getting into there, and it'll change the way the drums themselves sound and play. And then conversely, like you may want a sound, that's just super open, and so you get rid of the gobos or maybe put them just out of the way along the walls. A lot of gobos have two different sides, so they'll have a reflective side and an absorptive side. And then you could, in that case, you could bring them in and like have the reflective side closer to the drums to help liven up the space or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I've seen studios with rotating panels or panels like a big elephant ear that kind of flip over one side or the other on the walls, where you can have it be, soft fabric, or it can be hard surfaces.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. I've just never worked in one of those and really tried it out. So I don't really have any experience on how effective that is.
Yeah. I mean, it works, it works great. You can really change the character of a room. Or at least maybe, the character of the room, depending on, you'd have to have a lot of it, but like you can certainly change the character of what you're recording.
So on that decay time question again, you made a comment which I thought was interesting, which is no matter what you're wanting to do in your recording space, you're likely to find that it's nice if the decay time is relatively even across all the frequencies and not sort of loaded in one zone or another.
It's definitely a good target. It's less important. So I think like kind of just going back to the original question, like what should you do treatment wise? Like if you're in a, most rooms like kind of just always approaching this as if it's a home studio, like you're probably in a room with parallel walls. So you're going to want at the very least some like 2-inch deep panels up on the wall just to break up those reflections so you don't hear the flutter.
Yep.
That's not like, there's not so much of like a target. You have to have this percentage of the walls covered or that kind of thing. It's just like, you'll, experiment with it a little bit and cover, 30% of your walls, and you'll get rid of in the ceiling, any parallel spaces. You don't have to have treatment on all of them. Just limit, how many parallel surfaces there are, and that'll help a lot.
Let's address something that comes up a lot. Just like the people confusing soundproofing with sound treatment. I hear a lot of people start out a conversation, oh, it's great, there's like no parallel walls in here. Which is interesting to me, because I think there's something to talk about. I don't know if you want to jump into that topic. You're talking about it right now when you say, the issue with parallel walls is actually flutter echoes, and that's easy to treat. You just have to have absorption on one of those walls. And if the room's big enough, you can use diffusion to treat it as well. Diffusion just takes up more space, scattering sort of less space, so you can use that more. Having not, to your point, like if the walls most often, I would say most often, at least like in a studio setting, if you don't have parallel walls, that probably means it was like purpose built to be a studio, or like a mechanic's shop, so that the floor's slanted, right,
or a garage or anything like that.
Right,
you might get that benefit of like a slight slant, so everything drains that way. But most of the time it's gonna be like a purpose built studio space, and it will be very helpful in controlling a lot of your like higher and mid frequency reflections, so that you maybe don't have to have as much absorption on your side walls
because it's reflecting away from you. But now you're talking about a
right.
control room again, right? Typically,
either or. No, I mean, like not having parallel walls in a tracking room is great for that very reason, because you're not going to have weird flutter echoes.
Yeah. But I think one of the confusions is that it somehow solves room modes, which it doesn't. Actually, all it does is just make the modal math incredibly complicated.
For sure. It like, right. Yeah, it makes the math really complicated. You still very much don't have room modes. Unless your walls are angled at such like, because it's the way that you could, it doesn't, I mean, the way you could avoid that by having an incredibly large angled room, but the angle has to be like a pretty significant percentage of the wavelength. So like to not have room modes or to be able to break them up effectively, you'd have to have a massive room with a very steep angle. So it's not really feasible.
The OWC Envoy Pro Electron is the fastest, toughest, mini-sized, universal, portable USB-C SSD that lets you record from anywhere in the galaxy with confidence. With speeds of up to more than a gigabyte per second real-world performance, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron gives you high-speed audio data for recording and playback. Take your sessions and sample libraries with you anywhere you go. Built for reliability, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron is waterproof, dustproof, and crushproof. Never worry about your storage and the safety of your music again. Find the new OWC Envoy Pro Electron and all your storage needs at macsales.com/rockstars. You said you were over at Ben's place, which was RCA Studio A, right? Originally?
Yeah.
And that has that big, beautiful, huge room with the giant sort of cloud-like diffusion, curved ceiling and corners and stuff, right? Can you describe that room a little bit? And is there anything worth talking about as far as what makes that space sound the way it does?
Yeah. I mean, one, it's huge. So it's like 70 feet by, I'm guessing, but I think it's like 70 by 40 feet or so. Maybe a little bigger.
Is worth commenting. Ultimately, drops all the room modes so low that they're just out of the way. Is kind of
right. Yeah, you basically don't have a problem at that point.
Right.
And then it's also got like 30-foot ceilings. So massively tall ceilings, huge room, and then the walls were built. And they did this for all the RCA rooms, I believe. So in RCA, they've got these big, on the walls, they're like these big polycylindrical diffusers that are, I don't know, probably each section of them is 5 or 6 feet tall. So it's a pretty gradual, like convex shape that just kind of rounds off the wall, so that, even though the walls in that room, I believe, are parallel, but there's not a lot of parallel surfaces on the walls themselves. And then they're also made out of what was at least supposed to be an absorptive material. It's been painted a lot, so I don't know how absorptive it is at this point.
Right.
But the whole, big, huge room with very kind of gentle but effective diffusion, so that everything in there just kind of sounds great. And then there's a bunch of gobos. There's a few booths, and a lot of moving blankets and anything that you would need to kind of create whatever sound you wanted in that space.
Very cool. Yeah, and I feel like the big polycylindrical walls is something that you sometimes see in big theater spaces too, just big round walls.
Yeah, and it worked. They actually, they can also work in smaller rooms. When we tore them out this year, but I had them in my live room, like something kind of inspired by that room, where I just built them onto the wall out of like an 1/8-inch hardboard. You can get at Home Depot or wherever, and so you don't have to have a massive room to make that work. It can be a really effective kind of form of diffusion.
Yeah. So we just said we had Craig Parker Adams on the show too.
Cool.
I've done an interview with him, and he talked about Winslow Court Studio, which also has that diffusion on it. It's very cool.
Yeah.
In a smaller space like that, sort of floor to ceiling, big ones. So if you're going to make a curved wall like that, you're sort of warping or bending the plywood to make a curved shape somehow?
Yeah, exactly. So I used hardboard, which is like basically what pegboard's made out of without the holes. I think it's just sawdust glued together. But so I took a 1x2 piece of wood.
That's how I feel on some days.
Yeah. Took the 1x2 piece of wood, screwed it to the wall, and then did the same thing, but like 2 feet lower. And then just cut a piece of hardboard and put, that was wider than 2 feet so that when you pushed it in between those 2 pieces of wood and it was pinched in there, it curved.
Cool. And then again, would you sort of like try and sneak pink insulation behind that whole thing somehow?
Yeah. So I did, or if you wanted to do a better job, actually putting like 703 or mineral wool up on the wall before that so that it's not touching the hardboard. Because if you're not touching the hardboard, it will work as at least a little bit as a membrane trap. So it actually start to absorb lower frequencies as well.
Very cool. And then what about on the surface of that? Would you also put a 703 over the surface of it?
No, the surface of it I would just leave.
Okay.
Because you want it to be reflecting so that it's actually diffusing, into the room. So it's anything that hits it's getting broken up and reflected in a different direction.
Very cool. All right. Well, let me pivot to some other questions. How do we choose cool fabrics for our sound panels, and what do we want to know about an appropriate fabric? I mean, you talked about a sound porous polycylindrical diffuser that was painted over too many times, so you're not so sure how sound porous it is. What do we need to know when it comes to fabrics?
Yeah, I mean, most fabrics are going to work pretty well. There's acoustic fabrics out there. So like all the panels that we make are made with Guilford Maine fabric. You can buy stuff directly from them. They're an awesome company and they make really great fabric, but you can also go to down the street to a fabric store and, if you're making panels for yourself, get something there that's going to be a lot less expensive and will still work great. That's what I did when I first started making panels. And the only really important thing there is that it's not so thick that it's going to be reflecting sound.
Right.
As long as you're not using leather or any like duck cloth that's really thick. So anything like a really tight, thick weave isn't going to work well. If it's like
canvas
cotton based,
is probably not a good idea.
Yeah, right? Canvas, particularly if it's treated. So you can get untreated canvas, and it'd work okay as long as it's not too thick. Canvas actually comes in different densities. So the lighter ones would work.
Now, what about old school burlap and stuff?
Burlap works because it's got a really open weave. It's not great at holding in 703 particles if you're using 703.
Right.
Or mineral wool. That's one of those things that's more of an issue while you're making them than it is while they're up on your wall. Because once your panel is on the wall, you're not cutting it or shaking it or disturbing it in any way where it's actually releasing any particles. But you do want a fabric ideally that is capable of containing any dust or particles from the absorptive material that could potentially come out.
Dude, have you seen how loud I turn up the bass amp over here? Come on. We're disturbing everything we can. No, I'm just kidding.
But it would take a lot to shake them.
So I did burlap on panels my first go around, and things that I didn't know at the time. Sometimes it's hard for the burlap to be matching color. You can get some variation. It fades over time and it changes color. And then talk a little bit about the importance of just, making sure things are fireproof and just safety stuff that you've learned about.
Oh, yeah. The actual absorptive material in any panels, you're not gonna have an issue with fireproofing. Fabric, like cotton fabrics or any untreated polyester fabric, is gonna be very flammable. From a code standpoint, that's not a problem if you're in a home studio, but from a safety standpoint, you might want something that is fire rated or at least treated.
I'm just going to go ahead and say you want something that's safe for Rockstars.
Fair enough. Yeah. So you can do it yourself, or you can just buy fabric that is fire rated. So that's something if it is fire rated, whoever made it or whoever's selling it will surely state that. If it's not, you can buy a fire retardant spray, basically just a spray bottle, and you can spray the fabric yourself.
Yeah. Now, of course, if you're super health conscious, this may raise other issues about materials you use and everything. But that's a whole different topic. So I'll just stay away from that one. But I do think, it's a thing you just need to think about when you're doing your studio. You just need to think about safety. Like, what if something happens? I mean, I do have a friend who lost a studio to a fire, and thank God nobody was hurt. Nobody was in there at the time. But bad things can happen. So just make sure that you're, thinking about fire safety, thinking about like, can you even get out of the studio if you need to, stuff like that.
Yeah. And to your point about like burlap fading and being hard to color match, like that's also true of any like cheaper fabric that you do go, like any cotton-based fabric that like you go to the fabric store and buy. Like your panels in a couple of years, the fabric's not going to look great. So it is like, even if you're making your own, it is a good reason to get something from like a
high quality
just from
fabric,
a company. Yeah.
So now I've seen some people in town get really creative with the fabrics on their panels and like, paisleys and like psychedelic kind of looking stuff. Have you found some great sources for that? And do you guys make panels that are really cool looking like that? Or do you find that generally people go for solid colors and stuff? Most of our panels we just make out of solid colors. You can definitely do some cool things with them. Like you were talking about, we also make like art panels. So we have a sublimation printer that we work with, and they can print, any image that like a client sends our way. We can print on, and it's got, a pretty incredible resolution. So you can make the panels look like, anything you want. I've got one in my office here. It's just a big picture of my dog. That's super cool. Get that, rock stars. So you can basically, think studio logo, but then also think like, get creative with it. Maybe some of your favorite photos, maybe band photo, band photos and things like that.
Yeah, you can do. I mean, you can print anything that you have like a high enough resolution photo, you can have printed on a panel. And so it's a really cool way to either add artwork to a space or just to make them look a little cooler.
That's awesome. That sounds like lots of fun. Okay, cool. Some of the materials that go into constructing a panel, just give us a quick idea of the kind of stuff we might need around if we wanted to mess with this. Of course, you're building beautiful panels there, and Rockstars, you can click through and watch the videos there. And if you don't feel like, if this stuff starts to look advanced, or you're like, what, I think I just would like to just kind of get some that are ready to go, you have those to offer too. So we should talk about that. But if we were going to try and build some stuff, what kind of materials might we need to start thinking about? Yeah,
I mean, for the most part, they're pretty simple. So most acoustic panels or treatments have a wood frame, some sort of absorptive material. Most common ones being like Owens Corning 703 or 705, or any of the mineral wool products. We use mineral wool in our panels, and it works great. Or if you don't have access to that, you can get fluffy insulation. It'll still work pretty well.
And just to clarify that, so 703 is the yellow stuff that's kind of fairly rigid. It's kind of easy,
right?
Fairly easy to work with. You can take a knife and cut through it easily. Mineral wool is a little more loosey-goosey, and it can be a little challenging for DIY, right? A little more so than 703, or am I overthinking?
Not really. It's also it's not quite as uniform, I guess, in like the composition of it, like the actual material. So they're both really easy to work with. 703 is really itchy, so I don't like working with it. Personally, I don't actually. Fortunately, I don't make too many of our panels anymore. But 703 is pretty itchy. They're both easy to work with.
So 703 is made out of fiberglass, right?
Right.
And is mineral wool made out of something different?
Yeah,
minerals, it's like spun up minerals
like
or something.
Yeah. So it's like kind of a similar, I think, process to making it, but instead of using glass, it's like ground up rocks. And
right.
Basically just ground up rocks and metal and like the raw minerals that go into metal.
So Rockstars, when you're going to work with insulation, if you haven't done it before, don't be bold, don't be cool, don't be shirtless, thinking you're really breaking a sweat now, building some cool stuff. You got to wear long sleeves and gloves and stuff like that. And I don't know if you have to wear, breathing stuff or eye protection, but that insulation, I remember as a kid, my brother and I got into a closet we were with my mom somewhere and we went into the closet. And it's like somebody had insulation in there and we built a fort out of it and played in it.
Oh, no.
Oh my God. We were itching for like days and days because the fiberglass gets under your skin.
There's like nothing worse than the fluffy fiberglass stuff in terms of like how itchy it is.
Yeah.
So definitely wear gloves if you're cutting it or anything. Definitely wear a mask, and just because as you're cutting it, you can same thing with you're like cutting a piece of wood. Particles of that are going to fly up into the air.
Right, and then you're breathing them into your lungs and all that. Yeah.
If you're cutting a piece of wood, also a good idea to wear a mask.
Really? I've never heard that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's good for the lungs.
I like the smell of woodwork.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So 703 mineral wool. You said recycled denim is a material, but that's not for panels. That's for just filler.
You can use it for panels. We did a studio in California, and that's what we used for the entire thing. It was awesome.
That's cool. Does it have to be your own denim?
It does not. No. I don't know anybody who has that many pairs of jeans.
But at least you're helping the world out if you recycle all the denim. It's funny that it's just denim too, and it's not like
there's recycled cotton ones, but denim's for whatever reason a pretty popular one. Yeah. Just like some different recycled like paper-based products. There's some cool stuff out there. None of it's like quite really. None of it's at like a point manufacturing wise where it's super usable, at least for us from a panel standpoint. But there's definitely some cool stuff out there.
As a drummer, what are some of the aspects of room treatment that really make you feel like this room is right for drums?
In a smaller space, just not hearing a ton of like super boxy reflections. Something that like either is tight enough to create like a really fun, cool, tight, dry drum sound, or something that is open enough to give the drums a little bit of room to breathe and sound pretty even and not super harsh.
Howdy, rock stars. Do you feel like the time you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Here are just some of the things that students are saying about the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass. This one comes from David P. Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process I've ever been a part of. And Shane J. says, I've literally watched it 2 times at length, taken a plethora of notes, then combed back over some sections even more. You really knocked it out of the park on this one, and it was so incredibly eye-opening and useful immediately. Look, it's a lot of fun to mix. I'm like you, but it can be really frustrating to keep doing the same things over and over again, but not getting the results that you really want. So when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go check out ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and get started now using the free preview button where you can immediately watch Craig's ultimate snare mixing trick. Happy mixing, rock stars. If you can, in your mind, you're picturing a certain size of a room for both those examples, and then tell us like how many panels are we building or getting from you to put in a space to to give it that effect.
So I'm sitting in a room that's 10 feet by 11 feet, and there's 3 drum sets in here.
Almost a terrible control room, right?
Terrible control room. It's got way too many drums in it right now because I don't have anywhere else to put them.
Awesome.
So if I was going for like a really tight, dry sound in this space, I would want, let's see, basically like 3 or 4 panels on each of the side walls.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably at least 3 or 4 panels on the ceiling as well.
What's the floor? Is it wood or is
the floor is wood?
A rug on wood.
It's wood. Oh, if I was like and then with a rug underneath the drums. Okay. And particularly if you're recording drums in a really little room, like having panels again that are like at least 4 inches deep, would be really helpful.
Again, so those are 4-inch deep panels that are 4 inches set out from the wall.
If they can be, the air gap's just not as critical here because there's just nothing that's like as like from a critical listening standpoint as important as a control room. So like, but if you have the room for the air gap, by all means, do it.
Right, because you get a little more low end extension.
In this room, it'd be a little tough.
Yeah. What's it going to be, Rockstars? 4 inches of air or one more drum set?
Yeah.
We all know the answer to that one.
Probably the drums.
Drums all day long.
But yeah, I mean, that would pretty much get you there. There's still going to be a little bit of a reflection sound in this room. But if you put the drums close enough to like two of the treated walls, you can limit that even more. So that's what 12, 4 times 4. So 16. That's like in a pretty small room though. That's like 16 to 20 panels or so to get it really tight and dry sounding. And then if you wanted something a little bit more open, just probably take one panel off of each wall and then add in like space coupling diffusers, which are basically these diffusers is just like a grid of a bunch of little squares. And by far my favorite application for them is a drum tracking room, even in a bigger room. If they work for really tracking any instrument, and they work also really great in a control room setting. But it's like the one type of diffusion that works really well in a smaller space, and it just helps limit a lot of those early reflections that you'd have off of surfaces. And instead of absorbing them, you're still getting reflected sound, which will make the space sound a little bit bigger.
So it keeps it live, but controlled.
Just a little bit live, but like disperses all those reflections in so many different directions. And as you're doing that, you are absorbing a little bit of energy, but you're maintaining some of that life in the sound of the space itself. So it's going to be a little bit more of a unique sound with that character of the room.
Where does that thing go? Is it right up against the wall?
I would put them above the drums. It's like up on the ceiling. And then really just anywhere throughout the room. The placement of those isn't super critical for like a tracking setup. It's just helpful to have those in here or in a room like that, so that your ear is hearing some sort of reflections, but that aren't super harsh and really really focused. And when what happens, because sound travels kind of like light. So if you have a sound and it's traveling towards a wall, it bounces off that wall at the same angle that it was headed towards that wall, same angle of incidence. And so the space couplers diffuse all of that. Instead of having this one really focused like beam of sound then reflecting towards a microphone or anything else, it's now scattering it all over the place. And so you have this big reduction in energy, but a much more open reflected sound. So there is a little bit of space essentially in the recordings.
Have you seen anybody ever build gobos out of those and like sort of bring them around to like almost like a cage around the drums?
Not out of those, because they're completely open. So like there's no front, there's no like back to them. I've seen people make gobos out of like primitive root diffusers, like the Skyline type diffusers.
Right.
Something that has a solid back to it, and more mass, so that it both can kind of break up things. I've used space coupler diffusers as like just free, not actually mounted to a wall, just kind of so I could position them in the room. So I guess that's kind of a similar thing.
Does the space coupling diffuser, when I'm thinking about a drum kit, does it have a smoothing effect on the highs of cymbals, or is it more like we hear it takes some of the boxy bounce back away from the drums? Okay, both. Great. Makes everything mo better.
Yeah. So if you're just like, like kind of A-being a version of the drums recorded with and without it, without them, like that snare is going to be a much like spikier, kind of direct in your face, just like pokey sound. And then kind of the same thing. And then same thing with the cymbals. Everything's a little bit harsher. And just more like kind of spiky sounding. So kind of and then with it, you're going to smooth all of that out. So you get a little bit more body to everything, but you're also getting more space. The room kind of sounds like the walls will either move back or just disappear a little bit, and everything kind of smooths out.
That's very cool. Now, if the room's already deadened down, this won't add life to it.
It'll still work.
It'll help.
Yeah.
Okay.
We in control rooms, we actually use them a lot below a cloud. It's like you put in your big cloud to help deal with a lot of the lower frequency, like your floor to ceiling modes. But our ears need some sort of reflection so that we, have a sense of space and we can tell where we are. And so you can use them like above a desk to help kind of counteract some of the comb filtering effects of the desk itself, but also just add a sense of space and make things sound a little bigger than they would if you just had absorption everywhere.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, we are coming to the end of our interview. Believe it or not, we've been going for such a long stretch, man. Dude, this is really cool, man. And I love all the details you've dived into with us. Let me hit you with a couple of closing questions.
Sure.
And this one's tricky because it's a little different than usual since we're focused on the studio design. Okay, how about this, man? How about some of the best advice you received, maybe pertaining to studio design and panel building and, just getting a great sound?
Yeah. So I think, this was just kind of more like research based than coming from one person, but from having an air gap behind your panels is, I think, probably like understanding what that does and how much of an impact that can have on how well even the treatments that somebody might already have, or the treatments that I already had at the time when I was working on my studio, is like it's such a huge game changer.
What's a quick, easy hack for moving a panel out from the wall 4 inches? How would you hang? You can
just take like a little L bracket, like go to the Home Depot, buy an L bracket or Lowe's or local hardware store, and then put like a 2x4 on it, or even just screw a 2x4 straight into your wall and then hang the panel on that.
Okay.
Or if you want like a slightly easier way, if you're using like picture frame, may not look as good, but very quick and easy. You're using like picture frame wire, and then hang that just like from a hook like you normally would, but put a couple screws sticking out of the wall. Or I saw one person who used like door stops as spacers. So they use picture frame wire and then just like anything, basically like a door stop or a screw that's sticking out of the wall to create that space so the panel can't go all the way back to the wall.
Oh, down at the bottom of the panel?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Cool. I can dig that. All right, great. And then let's see. I'll just put you on the spot here just for fun. How about sharing a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something the rock stars could use on their next session? Some cool, fun thing to try in your session. I know you're like, I wasn't ready for this one. What's the first thing that comes to mind? It may be a drum one, since you're a drummer.
Put your room mics close to the floor.
All right, there we go. I knew you'd have it, dude. I knew. Just put you on the spot.
Yeah.
So what does that do for us?
It's like particularly in, maybe like if you're not works in a big studio as well, but in any room, if you put your mics close to the floor, like particularly room mics, you're limiting, you won't have a reflection off of the floor coming back to your mic that's canceling out whatever sound was like traveling directly to that mic. So kind of the same way you treat your early reflections in like a control room, if you put your room mics closer to the floor or even closer to your side walls, but at like head height, wherever they end up going, if they're close to one of those boundaries, you're just limiting one area where you can get a reflection off of that surface that will cause a big cancellation. So a lot of times that can make your rooms actually sound bigger and fuller and clearer.
Awesome. I love that. Well, dude, here's our final question. And again, thank you for joining us on the podcast. Of
course. Thanks for having me.
This one is hypothetical. You get to take the Wayback Studio machine and you go back in time, and you go back and find young Graham who's banging around on the drums thinking about like, maybe I'll make a record one day. And you say, listen, dude, I come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
I think I probably focused too much on like the technical side of things. So,
you mean like all those questions I just asked you today?
No, not so. Oh, I mean, I guess in part, yeah, but probably the reason I am also here today. So maybe it worked out well. But I think like from a, just from like a purely music and engineering standpoint of like not being so focused on, is this the right EQ for, what's your favorite vocal EQ or kick drum EQ or compressor, like those kinds of things that are super fun, but also at the end of the day, don't have a huge impact on the music you're making or like the listener's experience. Like nobody cares which EQ I was using or that I have like a favorite EQ. And I think when I started, I was much more focused on like, is this the right EQ for this thing? And like really the right EQ for whatever I was EQing was whatever was on it, whatever I had would have been fine. And I think, kind of like that, kind of honing in too much on the little details as opposed to like bigger picture of, does this feel good? And am I making something that's going to connect with people?
I think that's good advice, man. And then, it kind of touches back on the earlier question we were talking about, a monitor and how you found yourself a little less focused on the monitor and realizing that you needed to treat the room properly too. And that so many of our choices sound great now, but get that room right and it really brings it to life.
Yeah. I mean, gear is super fun, but ultimately it's just like a tool that we have at our disposal, and kind of the same thing with monitors and rooms can be that if they're treated well. Oddly enough, they're also kind of the thing that can hold you back in some weird ways. Not that you won't be able to do great work in any room. People make incredible records in bedrooms that don't have any treatment, and people make incredible records in the nicest studios in the world.
But more importantly, people also make some pretty bad ones.
Yeah, for sure.
I've had plenty of experience making mixes that didn't work out the way I expected them to. And, the more I've focused on getting the mixing setup right and the space right, and even the recording space, the happier I've been with the results. So that's great.
And it just lets you do, it lets you hear it lets you hear the EQs and the compressors and maybe why one, ultimately does make it, they do different things. So like it makes a difference, and the room will just, having a better room lets you hear all of those things, and it lets you do, work that will be more creative and more impactful and more emotional. And that's ultimately kind of the goal of creating music or art in any way.
Yeah. And then of course, one of the awesome options for your monitors, Rockstars, are these Atom Audio with the accelerated ribbon tweeter. They sound killer. I've got a pair of these T5Vs over to the side that I think sound awesome. So thank you again to Anders over at Atom for making our introduction. Graham, it's been great to have you here on the show. Thanks. How can the Rockstars find you? Where would you like them to go? Check you out if they want to either learn more about trying to do treatment for their studio DIY, or if they're just simply ready to take advantage of the fact that you've already figured out how to make these really great and make them affordable and accessible. Where should they go?
Yeah, they can they go to our website, which is just musiccityacoustics.com. We've got, obviously all the stuff we make is up there, but also a lot of really great resources and articles that we put together and written that are just really, I think, really good resources for people, trying to figure out how to treat a space. They can also check out our Instagram page, which our name on there is just Music City Acoustics. And then if they want to get in touch with me, if they have any questions about their studios or their setups or their spaces, they can just email me. And my email address is graham@musiccityacoustics.com.
Awesome. And then Rockstars, a reminder, I've got some of the music that Graham has worked on in the show notes, and also a YouTube playlist of videos. Actually, a bunch of the videos I think Anders shot over at Atom with you. And they're great, man. You do this beautiful walkthrough of your shop and showing how you do things, and it's just really impressive to see.
Yeah, Anders and Atom Audio has been pretty incredible. So we've made a few videos with them, and they've been great.
Awesome, dude. Well, thanks so much for hanging with us on Recording Studio Rockstars.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Look forward to meeting you in person. I know we're both in the hood, so we'll meet up and grab a coffee one day.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
All right, dude. Talk soon.
Cool. Have a good one.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who have helped make this episode possible. OWC, Atom Audio, Spectra 1964, Isotope, and JZ Microphones. Remember to use the coupon codes ROCK10 at isotope.com/rockstars for 10% off any plugin purchase, or start your extended 30-day free trial subscription to get access to lots of plugins, and Rockstars at jzmic.com for 50% off select vintage series mics for a limited time. And remember to visit the Atom Audio YouTube channel for free interviews and masterclasses. And use the coupon code ROCKSTAR for 10% off any course at Recording Studio Rockstars Academy for a limited time. You'll find links to all these wonderful sponsors in the description of this podcast. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and John Richardson for additional podcast and video production. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.